At 5:12 a.m. on Wednesday, April 18, 1906, the ground beneath San Francisco began to move. It was not a gentle tremor or a warning shudder. It was a violent, lateral tearing that threw people from their beds, toppled chimneys, cracked walls, and sent entire buildings sliding off their foundations. The city was still asleep. Streetcars sat idle in their barns. Fishermen were preparing their boats along the waterfront. Night watchmen made their final rounds. Then the earth lurched and everything changed. The first shock lasted approximately 40 seconds. That is not a long time by most measures. It is less than a minute. But in those 40 seconds, the built environment of a city of 400,000 people was fundamentally altered. Masonry crumbled. Wooden frames groaned and collapsed. Gas mains snapped. Electrical wires fell. The San Andreas Fault had ruptured along a 290-mile stretch, from the Mendocino coast down past San Juan Bautista. The epicenter was estimated to be just offshore from the Golden Gate. What happened next was not merely an earthquake. It was the beginning of a catastrophe that would unfold over the next 72 hours. Immediately after the shaking stopped, the silence was broken by sounds that had not existed moments before. The sound of falling debris, the sound of water gushing from broken mains, the sound of gas hissing from fractured pipes, and then the sound of the first flames. Within the first hour, roughly 50 separate fires had started across the city. Some were caused by overturned stoves and lamps. Others were caused by broken gas lines ignited by sparks from downed electrical wires. A few were started deliberately by residents attempting to cook breakfast outdoors after their chimneys collapsed, unaware that the ground beneath them was soaked with leaking gas. The fires would not be extinguished for 3 days. What happened to the city's water system that morning was decisive. San Francisco relied on a network of iron water mains supplied by reservoirs and storage tanks. The earthquake snapped the mains at hundreds of points. Joints failed. Pipes simply tore apart. Of the city's 40,000 water service connections, nearly half were broken. The pressure dropped immediately. When fire companies arrived at the first blazes, they connected their hoses to hydrants and found nothing. No water came out. Some hydrants were completely dry. Others produced only a weak trickle. The fire department had equipment, trained men, and decades of experience fighting urban fires, but they had no water. The first major fire began at 5:15 a.m. in the commercial district near the intersection of Kearny and Clay Streets. It started in a stove in a modest building housing a grocery store and several apartments. Within 30 minutes, it had spread to adjoining structures. Firefighters arrived quickly at the scene and attempted to connect to nearby hydrants. They found no water pressure. They attempted to draft water from the bay and from cisterns buried beneath the streets. Some cisterns still held water. Many had been cracked open by the shaking or were simply too few to supply the scale of the fire. The crew watched helplessly as the flames grew. A second fire began at approximately 5:30 a.m. in the Hayes Valley neighborhood, near the intersection of Hayes and Go Streets. A woman at 395 Hayes Street had attempted to cook breakfast on a stove whose flue had been damaged by the earthquake. The fire escaped into the walls. This blaze would eventually become the largest and most destructive of the entire disaster. It would burn for 3 days, consuming everything in its path as it moved north and east through the city's densest residential and commercial districts. By 6 a.m., the military had begun to mobilize. General Adolphus Greeley, then 72 years old and a veteran of the Arctic and the Civil War, was the commander of the Presidio, the army base at the northwestern edge of the city. He ordered troops into the streets. The Army's role in a civil disaster was not clearly defined by law or regulation, but in San Francisco on that morning, there was no time for legal deliberation. The mayor, Eugene Schmitz, issued a proclamation giving the military authority over the city. He ordered that any person found looting or committing other crimes would be shot on sight. The proclamation was illegal under the California Constitution, but it was enforced nonetheless. Brigadier General Frederick Funston, acting without direct orders from Washington, took command of the city's military response. He ordered troops to protect vital infrastructure, secure the waterfront, and assist firefighters. He also ordered them to patrol the streets and maintain order. By 9 a.m., 15,000 troops were deployed throughout the city. Their presence would shape the next 72 hours in ways both necessary and controversial. The fire in the commercial district continued to grow. By 7 a.m., it had reached the financial district. The Merchants Exchange Building, the Stock Exchange, and the U.S. Mint were all threatened. Firefighters attempted to create fire breaks by dynamiting buildings in the path of the flames. This was a common technique in an era before modern firefighting foam and aerial water drops. The idea was simple: remove the fuel, and the fire cannot spread. But the dynamiting was often poorly executed. Untrained volunteers and inexperienced soldiers handled the explosives. Buildings were sometimes blown apart before the fire reached them, creating piles of splintered wood that served as excellent kindling. In some cases, the dynamiting actually accelerated the spread of the fire. At 7:30 a.m., the fire had reached the Palace Hotel, one of the city's most famous landmarks, home to visiting dignitaries and wealthy businessmen. Guests fled into the streets in their night clothes. The hotel's famed garden court, a vast interior space with a glass roof and tropical plants, was consumed in minutes. By 8 a.m., the building was gutted. It would not reopen for 3 years. Who was responsible for the dynamiting decisions? The answer is complicated. Mayor Schmitz had formed a committee of 50, a group of civic leaders, engineers, and military officers, to advise him on emergency measures. The committee authorized the use of explosives, but the actual dynamiting was carried out by individual army officers, police officials, and sometimes private citizens with no training. There was no centralized command. There was no communication between different teams of dynamiters. Fires were being fought in separate neighborhoods by separate groups with no coordination. In some cases, a building was dynamited by one team only to have another team dynamite the same ruins again later. By 10 a.m., the fire in the Hayes Valley had merged with the fire from the commercial district. Together, they formed a front nearly a mile wide, driven by a rising wind from the southwest. The wind was crucial. It carried embers ahead of the main fire, starting spot fires in areas thought to be safe. It fed oxygen into the flames, increasing their intensity, and it pushed the fire inexorably toward the city's core. The city's infrastructure was collapsing in ways beyond the water system. Telegraph and telephone lines were down. The city's network of wired communication, which had linked police stations, firehouses, newspapers, and city offices, was gone within the first hour. Reports from distant neighborhoods arrived only by messenger, on foot or horseback. The mayor, the fire chief, and the military commanders had no reliable way to know what was happening beyond their immediate vicinity. Decisions were made on incomplete information. Orders were given based on rumors. The fog of disaster, which in modern emergencies is reduced by radio and satellite communication, was absolute. How many people died in the first hour? That question would not be answered for decades. The official death toll from the earthquake and fire was originally reported as roughly 700. That number was based on body counts, which were incomplete. Many bodies were never recovered from the rubble or the fire. Many were buried in mass graves without identification. In 2005, a team of historians and seismologists revised the estimate upward. Their analysis suggested that at least 3,000 people died, and possibly as many as 6,000. Most of those deaths occurred in the first 12 hours, either crushed by falling debris or trapped in the path of the advancing flames. At 11 a.m., a third major fire started near the waterfront in the wharf area south of Market Street. This fire was caused by the failure of a natural gas line under the docks. The waterfront was a place of wooden piers, warehouses filled with lumber, coal, and oil, and ships tied to the docks. Within an hour, the entire southern waterfront was ablaze. Ships were forced to cast off and move into the bay to avoid being burned. The fire crept north along the Embarcadero, threatening the ferry building, the city's main transportation terminal. The ferry building was the only way out of the city for the hundreds of thousands of residents who did not own automobiles or horses. The bridges across the bay did not yet exist. The Bay Bridge would not open until 1936. The Golden Gate Bridge would not open until 1937. For the residents of San Francisco on April 18, 1906, the only land routes out of the city were the ferries across the bay to Oakland, Sausalito, and Berkeley. The ferry building operated 24 hours a day, carrying tens of thousands of commuters daily. On that morning, it became the focal point of the largest mass evacuation in American history up to that time. By noon, the streets near the ferry building were choked with people. They carried what they could: suitcases, bundles of clothing, household valuables, children. Some pushed carts. Some carried elderly relatives on their backs. The Army had established a cordon around the ferry terminal, allowing only women and children to board at first, then opening it to all refugees as the fire grew closer. The boats ran continuously, loading and unloading, returning for another load. By the end of the day, an estimated 200,000 people had crossed the bay to safety. What about the people who stayed? In the neighborhood south of Market Street, where working-class families lived in cheap wooden boarding houses and tenements, the fire moved faster than people could run. The wooden buildings, packed closely together on narrow streets, ignited like a dry forest. Residents who had survived the earthquake emerged into the streets only to find walls of flame closing in from both directions. Some ran north toward the bay. Some ran west toward the hills. Some found refuge in open lots, in parks, or in the cemeteries that then existed within the city limits. By 2 p.m., the fire had crossed Market Street, the city's main commercial thoroughfare. Market Street ran diagonally across the city from the waterfront to the hills. It was wide, lined with grand buildings of stone and brick. The fire jumped the street easily, carried by the wind and by burning debris. The buildings on the north side of Market Street began to burn. The Call Building, the Spreckles Building, the Chronicle Building, all newspaper headquarters, were engulfed. The entire downtown core, the financial center of the West Coast, was now on fire. The Army had begun a new tactic by mid-afternoon. Rather than trying to stop the fire with water they did not have, they focused on creating fire breaks by clearing or destroying entire blocks ahead of the flames. Streets were widened by demolition. Buildings that might serve as a bridge for the fire were removed. In the Van Ness Avenue area, a wide boulevard that ran north-south through the city, the Army planned a final defensive line. They would dynamite every building on the east side of Van Ness Avenue, creating an open space that the fire could not cross. It was a desperate gamble. If it failed, the fire would sweep into the western neighborhoods, including the Presidio and the remaining residential districts. At 4 p.m., the first major fire break was attempted near the intersection of Van Ness Avenue and Golden Gate Avenue. Soldiers and volunteers planted dynamite charges in a row of large mansions. The charges were set and detonated. The buildings collapsed, but the debris caught fire almost immediately, creating a new source of fuel. The fire crossed Van Ness Avenue anyway. The tactic had failed at that point. The failure of the dynamite strategy became a pattern. Throughout the evening of April 18th, teams of dynamiters worked ahead of the fire, but the results were inconsistent. Some explosions created effective fire breaks. Others created new fires. Some buildings that had been dynamited were later found to have been unnecessary sacrifices. Other buildings that were not dynamited became conduits for the fire's spread. The lack of coordination, the absence of a unified command, and the sheer speed of the fire made effective firefighting nearly impossible. How could the city have been better prepared? San Francisco had suffered major fires before. In 1849, 1850, and 1851, the city had burned partially or entirely. After each fire, the city had rebuilt, often with the same materials and the same density. The building codes were weak. Masonry buildings were required to have some earthquake reinforcement, but the standards were minimal and enforcement was lax. Wooden buildings were allowed in most of the city, even in the densely built core. The water system had not been designed for a fire of this scale. The cisterns, which had been installed after earlier fires, were too few and too small. The city had grown faster than its infrastructure could support. By nightfall on April 18th, the fire was still burning out of control. The glow of the flames could be seen from as far away as Sacramento, 90 miles inland. In the city itself, the sky was black with smoke. The moon, which was nearly full that night, was invisible. The streets were lit only by the fire. Refugees huddled in Golden Gate Park, on the Presidio parade ground on the beaches of the western shore. They wrapped themselves in blankets and coats. Many had no shelter at all. The temperature dropped into the 40s. It was a cold April night, and the survivors had no homes to return to. At midnight, the fire reached Nob Hill, the wealthy residential district where the mansions of the railroad barons and mining millionaires stood. The Flood Mansion, the Hopkins Mansion, the Crocker Mansion, the Stanford Mansion, all were destroyed. Some had survived the earthquake intact. None survived the fire. The Fairmont Hotel, which had been under construction and was nearly complete, was gutted. Its steel frame remained standing, blackened and twisted. It would be rebuilt and would reopen the following year. The first day of the disaster was over. The earthquake had lasted 40 seconds. The fire had burned for 19 hours and would continue for 2 more days. An area of approximately 4 square miles, the entire central core of the city, had been reduced to ash and rubble. The official tally of buildings destroyed would eventually reach 28,000. 250,000 people, more than half the city's population, were homeless. The number of dead was unknown but was clearly in the thousands. What systems had failed? The water system was the most obvious, but the communication system had also failed. The command and control structure among the fire department, the police, and the military had been inadequate. The dynamiting strategy, which might have worked with better coordination, had been poorly executed. The building codes had been insufficient to protect against an earthquake of this magnitude, and the city's emergency planning, such as it was, had assumed that the earthquake and the fire would be separate events. No one had planned for them to happen simultaneously. The next 72 hours would test the city's remaining resources. The fire would continue to spread. The army would impose martial law. The refugees would face disease, hunger, and exposure. And the political and economic consequences would reshape the city for generations. But on that first night, as the fire burned and the survivors waited for dawn, the only certainty was that nothing would ever be the same. At 5:30 a.m. on Thursday, April 19th, the second day of the disaster, the fire was still burning. The wind had shifted overnight, pushing the flames in a new direction. The fire had consumed nearly everything east of Van Ness Avenue, from the waterfront to the hills. Now it was turning north, toward the Presidio and the remaining residential neighborhoods of the western side. The Army's dynamite strategy was about to receive its most critical test. General Funston had ordered a second defensive line established along Van Ness Avenue, this time with more careful planning. The buildings on the east side of the street were to be destroyed, not by amateur dynamiters but by trained Army engineers. The charges were placed carefully, set to collapse the buildings inward. At 6 a.m., the first detonations were carried out. The buildings fell in a row, creating a clear zone approximately 100 yards wide. This time, the firebreak held. The flames reached the edge of the demolished area, found no fuel to cross, and stopped. The firebreak on Van Ness Avenue was the turning point. The fire would not cross into the western neighborhoods, but it was still burning in other parts of the city. The south, the fire was moving toward the Mission District, a densely populated area of working-class homes and wooden businesses. To the north, the fire was burning along the waterfront, threatening the remaining docks and warehouses. The fire would continue for another full day before it was finally contained. Throughout April 19th, the Army continued to patrol the streets. The martial law proclamation had led to a number of incidents. soldiers shot and killed at least 7 people suspected of looting. Some of these shootings were later investigated and found to be unjustified. In at least one case, a man was shot for taking a loaf of bread from a ruined bakery. In another case, a man was killed for picking up a piece of jewelry from the street. The military's response was harsh, and in some cases it was indiscriminate. The refugees, already traumatized by the loss of their homes and their city, now lived under the threat of execution for minor offenses. By the afternoon of April 19th, a new problem had emerged. With no functioning water system, no sewer system, and tens of thousands of people living in temporary camps, sanitation was becoming a crisis. The city had no way to dispose of waste. The streets were filled with rubble and debris. Dead animals, horses and dogs that had been killed in the earthquake or the fire, lay where they had fallen. The smell of smoke was overwhelming. The smell of decomposition was beginning to join it. The army established refugee camps in Golden Gate Park, the Presidio, and along the beaches near the Cliff House. These camps were organized with military precision. Tents were arranged in rows, latrines were dug, food was distributed, medical stations were set up. The camps would house tens of thousands of people for months. Some refugees would live in these camps for more than a year. At 8 p.m. on April 19th, the fire was still burning in the Mission District and along the southern edge of the city. Firefighters, exhausted and working without proper equipment, continued to battle the flames. They had begun to use salt water from the bay, pumping it through hoses laid along the wharves. It was not an ideal solution. Salt water corroded the pumping equipment and damaged the hoses. But it was water, and it was the only water they had. By midnight on April 19th, the second full day of the disaster, the fire had burned for 43 hours. More than 25,000 buildings had been destroyed. The economic loss was estimated at $400 million, a sum that at the time was roughly equal to the entire annual federal budget of the United States. Insurance companies, many of which had written policies covering fire damage but not earthquake damage, were facing ruin. The city's economy, which had been one of the most dynamic in the country, was in a state of total collapse. At 7 a.m. on Friday, April 20th, the third day, the fire was finally contained. The last active flames were extinguished in the Mission District. The fire had burned for a total of approximately 74 hours. It had destroyed everything within a 4-mile by 2-mile area. The city's downtown was gone. Its financial district was gone. Its theaters, hotels, department stores, churches, and newspaper offices were gone. The city's architectural heritage, the buildings that had made San Francisco one of the most distinctive cities in America, was reduced to ash and twisted metal. What remained? The street grid was still visible in places, marked by the foundations of buildings that no longer existed. The steel frames of a few larger buildings like the Fairmont Hotel and the Call Building stood as skeletons. The cable car lines were damaged but not destroyed. The western neighborhoods west of Van Ness Avenue were largely intact. The Presidio and the Army base had survived. Golden Gate Park was untouched. The city's geography, its hills and its bay, remained. And its people, 200,000 of them who had fled and the tens of thousands who remained, were still alive. The final death toll would not be known for decades. The city's official records were destroyed. Bodies were buried in mass graves. Some bodies were never recovered, buried under rubble that was never excavated. The official count of 775 deaths was later revised to more than 3,000. Some estimates suggest that the true number may have been as high as 6,000. In the immediate aftermath, no one had time to count. What did investigators later find? The earthquake itself was studied by geologists who realized, for the first time, that the San Andreas Fault was a single, continuous feature that could produce earthquakes of this magnitude. The fire was studied by engineers who recognized the vulnerability of urban water systems to seismic events. The response was studied by emergency planners who saw the need for clear lines of authority, reliable communication systems, and coordinated command structures. The disaster became a textbook example of what happens when a natural event overwhelms the infrastructure designed to contain it. Why does it still matter? The 1906 earthquake and fire exposed the fragility of modern cities. San Francisco was not an old city. It was not poorly built by the standards of its time. It had modern water systems, fire departments, building codes, and a professional military. And still, in less than 3 days, it was destroyed. The disaster demonstrated that urban resilience is not about any single system, but about the interaction of all systems. When water fails, communication fails. When communication fails, command fails. When command fails, strategy fails. And when strategy fails, the city burns. The rebuilding of San Francisco would begin almost immediately. Within weeks, temporary buildings were erected. Within months, the first permanent structures were rising. The city would be rebuilt in a style that would come to define it: Beaux Arts architecture, broad avenues, a civic center, and a commitment to modernity that bordered on defiance. The 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition, held in a newly built Palace of Arts and Gardens, announced to the world that San Francisco had not only survived but had reinvented itself. But the 72 hours of April 18th to April 20th, 1906, remain the defining event in the city's history. They are a reminder that the ground beneath our feet is not as solid as it seems, that the systems we rely on are never as robust as we imagine, and that when a city falls, it falls not all at once but in sequence. First the ground, then the water, then the fire, then the order, and finally the hope that anything will ever be the same again. What happened in the days after the fire was contained? How did the city feed its refugees, house its homeless, and begin the long process of recovery? How did the decision to rebuild and not to relocate shape the modern city? And what questions about the response, about the military's use of force, about the failures of coordination, about the decisions that prioritized some neighborhoods over others, remain unanswered more than a century later? The 72 hours had ended, but their consequences were just beginning. At 6 a.m. on Saturday, April 21st, 1906, 2 days after the last flames were extinguished, the first organized food distribution began in Golden Gate Park. The Army had established a central commissary in the park's conservatory. Hundreds of refugees lined up in rows. Each person received a loaf of bread, a tin of canned meat, and a cup of coffee. The portions were small, the nutrition was minimal, but for thousands who had not eaten a full meal since the earthquake, it was the first sign that the city was still capable of providing for its people. The logistics of feeding a displaced population of more than 200,000 people were staggering. The city had no working bakeries, no grocery stores, no functioning supply chains. Every single loaf of bread, every can of food, every cup of water had to be brought in from outside. The Army used the remaining rail lines that connected San Francisco to the rest of the country. Trains arrived from Oakland, from Sacramento, from Los Angeles, from as far away as Chicago. Each train carried food, medical supplies, tents, blankets, and tools. On April 22nd, the third day after the fire, the city's water system was partially restored. Crews from the Spring Valley Water Company worked around the clock to repair broken mains. They found that the earthquake had snapped pipes at dozens of points. The cast iron pipes, brittle and old, had shattered where the ground had shifted. In some areas, the pipes had been crushed by collapsing buildings. In others, they had simply pulled apart at the joints. The repair crews had to dig through rubble, through debris, through the still smoldering remains of buildings. By the end of the week, water was flowing again to the western neighborhoods, but the downtown area would remain dry for months. The health crisis deepened. On April 23rd, reports of typhoid fever appeared in the refugee camps. The disease spreads through contaminated water and poor sanitation. In the camps, latrines were overflowing. Garbage was piling up. The Army issued orders that all waste must be buried at least 2 feet deep. But the ground was hard and the tools were few. Many camp residents simply dug shallow trenches. The smell of human waste mixed with the smell of smoke. Flies multiplied. The city's health officer, Dr. William C. Hassler, warned that an outbreak of disease could kill more people than the earthquake and fire combined. The city's response was swift. On April 24th, a quarantine was declared in the camps. Anyone showing symptoms of typhoid was isolated. Water was boiled before drinking. Latrines were relocated and dug deeper. The army assigned soldiers to monitor sanitation. They patrolled the camps with sticks, forcing residents to cover their waste. It was not a gentle system, but it worked. The typhoid outbreak was contained. Only a few dozen cases were reported. No epidemic followed. Meanwhile, the process of identifying the dead continued. On April 25th, a temporary morgue was set up in the city's Hall of Records, which had survived the fire. Bodies were brought in by the hundreds. Many were burned beyond recognition. Some were little more than skeletons. The coroner, Dr. William W. Morrow, established a system of identification based on personal effects, dental records, and clothing. But the task was overwhelming. By the end of the first week, only a fraction of the bodies had been identified. The rest were buried in mass graves at the city's Potter's Field, a pauper's cemetery near the ocean. No headstones were placed. No records were kept of exactly who was buried where. The decision to bury the dead in mass graves was controversial. Some families demanded proper burials, but the city had no time for individual funerals. The bodies were decomposing in the heat. The risk of disease was too great. On April 27th, the city ordered that all unclaimed bodies be buried immediately. The graves were dug by prisoners from the county jail. The bodies were wrapped in canvas and lowered into the ground. A brief prayer was read. Then the dirt was shoveled back. Within a week, the mass graves were filled. The location of the graves was marked only on a map kept by the city clerk. That map would later be lost. The exact location of the mass graves remains unknown to this day. The military's role in the aftermath grew increasingly controversial. On April 28th, a report surfaced that soldiers had shot and killed a man for attempting to steal a watch from a jewelry store. The shooting was investigated by the Army's provost marshal. The soldier claimed he had warned the man to stop. The man had not stopped. The soldier fired. The investigation concluded that the shooting was justified under martial law. But the incident fueled public anger. Many San Franciscans felt that the Army had overstepped its authority. They pointed to the shooting of the man for taking a loaf of bread on April 19th. They pointed to the shooting of the man for picking up a piece of jewelry on the same day. They argued that the Army's response was disproportionate, that the punishment did not fit the crime. On April 29th, the city's mayor, Eugene Schmitz, who had been a central figure in the early response, announced that martial law would be lifted. The Army would remain in the city, but its authority would be limited to securing federal property and maintaining order in the camps. The police department, which had been largely ineffective during the first days, would resume its normal duties. The transition was not smooth. The police were understaffed and overwhelmed. Many officers had lost their homes. Some had lost their families. They were exhausted and traumatized. The first week of May saw a spike in crime. Theft, assault, and looting persisted, though at a lower level than before. On May 1st, the city's first official count of the destruction was released. The San Francisco Real Estate Board estimated that 28,188 buildings had been destroyed. Of those, 18,630 were residential. The rest were commercial, industrial, and public buildings. The assessed value of the lost property was $250 million, but that figure did not include the value of the contents: furniture, artwork, machinery, inventory, and personal belongings. When those losses were added, the total approached $400 million. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $13 billion in today's dollars. The insurance industry was in chaos. Most policies covered fire but excluded earthquake damage. The question of whether the destruction was caused by the earthquake itself or by the subsequent fire became a legal battleground. Insurance companies argued that the shaking caused the buildings to collapse, and therefore the damage was due to earthquake, not fire. Policyholders argued that the fires were the primary cause of destruction, and therefore they were entitled to payment. The courts would eventually side with the policyholders in most cases. But the legal battles dragged on for years. Some insurance companies went bankrupt. Others paid out only a fraction of the claims. Many families received nothing. The city's economy was in ruins. The banking system had collapsed. The banks had been closed since the earthquake. Many of their buildings were destroyed. Their records were burned. Their vaults were filled with rubble. On May 5th, the leading banks in the city announced that they would reopen in temporary facilities. They would honor all deposits, but withdrawals would be limited to $100 per person per month. It was a system designed to prevent a run on the banks. It worked. But it also meant that many people could not access their savings to rebuild. The federal government stepped in. On May 6th, President Theodore Roosevelt authorized the release of $2.5 million in emergency relief funds. The money was used to buy food, medicine, and building materials. The Red Cross, under the leadership of Clara Barton, who was then 84 years old, set up a relief headquarters in the city. She coordinated the distribution of supplies from across the country. The American public responded with an outpouring of donations. Money, clothing, blankets, and food arrived by the trainload. The city's refugees were fed, clothed, and housed, if barely. But the relief effort was not without its problems. On May 10th, a scandal broke. It was discovered that some of the food donated to the relief effort had been spoiled. Canned goods had been recalled from previous years. Bread had been stale. Meat had been rotten. The cause was not malice but poor logistics. The donations had been collected in a hurry without proper inspection. The relief committee, led by the city's business leaders, quickly implemented a system of quality control. All incoming food was inspected before distribution. The spoiled food was burned. But the incident damaged public trust. The question of where to rebuild became a central debate. On May 15th, a group of prominent businessmen, including Andrew Carnegie and William H. Crocker, proposed that the city should be redesigned from scratch. They argued that the destruction was an opportunity to create a modern city with wider streets, more parks, and better infrastructure. They proposed a plan that would have leveled the remaining hills, straightened the street grid, and created a grand boulevard along the waterfront. The plan was called the Burnham Plan, after the architect Daniel Burnham, who had designed the plan for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. But the Burnham Plan was never implemented. The property owners who had survived the fire did not want to wait. They wanted to rebuild immediately. They did not want to surrender their land for new streets or parks. They did not want to pay for new infrastructure. The city's government, weakened by the disaster and divided by politics, could not enforce a comprehensive plan. Within weeks of the fire, the first temporary buildings rose from the rubble. They were simple wooden structures, often built on the same lots as the buildings that had burned. They were not beautiful. They were not safe. They were not planned, but they provided shelter. By June 1, 1906, more than 10,000 temporary buildings had been constructed. They were called earthquake shacks. They were small, single-room structures, about 14 feet by 20 feet. They were built by the Army, using lumber donated by the federal government. Each shack cost about $100 to build. They were given to families who had lost their homes. The shacks were placed in designated camp areas, often in rows. They had no running water, no electricity, no sewage. They were meant to be temporary. Some families would live in them for more than a decade. The city's infrastructure was slowly being restored. On June 15th, the streetcar system resumed limited service. The cable cars, which had been damaged by the earthquake, were repaired and returned to service by July. The telephone system, which had been knocked out by the earthquake, was restored in stages. The first telegraph line was re-established on April 19th, just hours after the fire began. But the telephone exchanges had been destroyed. It took months to rebuild them. The public health crisis continued to evolve. On June 20th, an outbreak of smallpox was reported in one of the refugee camps. The disease is highly contagious. It spreads through respiratory droplets. In a crowded camp, it could spread quickly. The city's health department immediately quarantined the affected area. Vaccinations were administered to all camp residents. The outbreak was contained. But it was a reminder that the disaster was not over. The city was still vulnerable. The psychological toll of the disaster began to manifest. On June 25th, a man was found dead in his tent. He had hanged himself. His note said that he could not bear the loss of his family, his home, and his business. He was not alone. The city's suicide rate spiked in the months after the earthquake. The mental health of survivors was not a priority. There were no counselors, no therapy, no support groups. People coped as best they could. Some turned to alcohol, some turned to religion, some turned to work, some turned to despair. The reconstruction of the city's commercial district began in earnest in July. The first large building to rise was the Merchants Exchange building, which had been destroyed in the fire. Its owner, the banker James R. Keene, announced that he would rebuild with reinforced concrete. The new building would be fireproof. It would be earthquake-resistant. It would be a symbol of the city's resilience. Other businesses followed. By the end of 1906, more than 5,000 building permits had been issued. The city was rising from its ashes. But the recovery was uneven. The wealthy neighborhoods like Nob Hill and Pacific Heights were rebuilt quickly. The owners had resources, they had insurance money, they had access to credit. The poorer neighborhoods like the Mission District and the South of Market were rebuilt slowly. Many families could not afford to rebuild at all. They remained in the earthquake shacks. They remained in the camps. Some never returned. The disaster had reshaped the city's geography of wealth and poverty. The question of why the disaster happened and what could have been done differently began to be asked in earnest. In July 1906, a commission of geologists and engineers was appointed to investigate the earthquake. They traveled along the San Andreas Fault, measuring the displacement. They found that the ground had shifted as much as 21 feet in some places. They mapped the fault line for the first time. They concluded that the earthquake was not a random event but a predictable phenomenon. The fault would rupture again. The question was when. The investigation also examined the city's building codes. They found that many buildings had not been designed to withstand earthquake forces. The brick buildings in particular were vulnerable. The mortar was weak. The walls were not reinforced. The foundations were shallow. The commission recommended new building codes that required steel reinforcement and stronger foundations. But the codes were not enforced uniformly. Many builders ignored them. The cost was too high. The fire investigation revealed failures in the water system. The hydrants had been empty. The pipes had been broken. The reservoirs had been drained. The commission recommended that the city build a separate water system for firefighting, with its own reservoirs and pumping stations. That recommendation led to the construction of the San Francisco Auxiliary Water Supply System, which remains in use today. It was a direct response to the 1906 disaster. It would protect the city from future fires. The military's response was also studied. The commission found that the Army had acted with good intentions, but without sufficient coordination. The communication failures between the Army and the city government had led to confusion. The shootings of civilians were condemned. The commission recommended that in future disasters, a single civilian authority should be in charge, with military support only as requested. That recommendation would influence emergency management for decades. By September 1906, the city's population had stabilized. About 300,000 people remained. Another 100,000 had left permanently. The camps were still home to 50,000 people. The earthquake shacks still dotted the landscape. The city's economy was slowly reviving. The port was operating. The factories were reopening. The banks were lending again. But the scars were everywhere. The empty lots, the boarded windows, the homeless families, the memories of the 3 days that had changed everything. On September 18, 1906, 5 months after the earthquake, the city held a memorial service at the site of the temporary morgue. A simple stone marker was erected. It read, "In memory of the thousands who perished in the earthquake and fire of April 18, 1906. Their names are known only to God." The service was attended by the mayor, the governor, and thousands of survivors. They stood silently. They remembered. They vowed to never forget, but forgetting was impossible. The disaster had left its mark on every aspect of the city. The architecture changed. The building codes changed. The water system changed. The emergency response changed. The city's identity changed. San Francisco became a city that knew it could be destroyed, and that knowledge shaped everything it did. Today, more than a century later, the 1906 earthquake and fire remain a touchstone. They are studied by engineers, historians, and emergency planners. They are remembered by generations of San Franciscans. The 72 hours that began at 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, and ended with the containment of the fire on April 20th, are not just a chapter in the city's history. They are the chapter that defines everything that came after. The city that rose from the ashes is not the same city that burned. It is a city that learned, that adapted, and that survives. But the story does not end with survival. The months that followed would test the city's resolve in ways no one had anticipated. On October 11, 1906, 6 months after the earthquake, the first of several major insurance settlements was announced. The Aetna Insurance Company agreed to pay $2.5 million to policyholders. It was a fraction of the total claims. Many insurance companies had been overwhelmed. Some had gone bankrupt. Others argued that the damage was caused by the earthquake, not the fire, and their policies did not cover earthquakes. The legal battles would drag on for years. What happened? The insurance industry was not prepared for a disaster of this magnitude. Policies were written in vague language. The distinction between earthquake damage and fire damage became a courtroom battlefield. Policyholders who had lost everything were told they would receive nothing. The San Francisco Board of Fire Underwriters estimated total insured losses at $235 million, but only about $100 million was ever paid out. The rest was lost in litigation, insolvency, and denial. The fraud also began to surface. In November 1906, a grand jury was convened to investigate allegations of arson. Some property owners had set their own buildings on fire after the earthquake, hoping to collect insurance on the contents. They had assumed the fire would be blamed on the disaster, but investigators found evidence: burned books, suspicious accelerant patterns, and witnesses who reported seeing people with torches. 8 people were indicted. 3 were convicted. The rest fled. The trials were public. They revealed a darker side of the disaster: greed. By December 1906, winter had arrived. The refugee camps, which had been tolerable in the mild autumn, became unbearable. Rain turned the streets of canvas tents into mud. The wooden earthquake shacks, though better than tents, had no insulation. Temperatures dropped into the 40s at night. Children got sick. The old died. On December 12th, a storm swept through the city, collapsing several tents and flooding the camp at Golden Gate Park. The army rushed to erect new structures, but the damage was done. The number of homeless in the camps had not decreased. It had held steady at about 50,000. How could this have happened? The city had promised to move people out of the camps by winter, but the reconstruction was moving too slowly. Building materials were scarce. Lumber prices had tripled. Labor was expensive. The city's bureaucracy was paralyzed by corruption and infighting. The mayor, Eugene Schmitz, was under investigation for bribery. The board of supervisors was in chaos. The relief committees were overwhelmed. The homeless were stuck. On January 10, 1907, a fire broke out in the camp at Fort Mason. It started in a makeshift kitchen. The tents were packed close together. The wind carried the flames across the camp. In 20 minutes, 40 tents were destroyed. 2 people died. The survivors were moved to another location. The incident forced the city to accelerate the camp closure plan. By February, the army began demolishing the tents. Residents were relocated to earthquake shacks or to private housing. But many still had no place to go. The trial of Mayor Schmitz began on March 4, 1907. He was charged with extortion and bribery. The evidence was damning. He had accepted payments from the Pacific States Telephone and Telegraph Company in exchange for favorable franchise deals. The trial lasted 3 weeks. On March 27th, he was found guilty. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but he appealed. The case went to the California Supreme Court. In 1908, the conviction was overturned on a technicality. Schmitz was freed. He returned to politics. The corruption that had plagued the city before the earthquake continued after. But the disaster also produced reformers. In April 1907, a group of business leaders and engineers formed the Committee of 40. Their goal was to oversee the reconstruction of the city's infrastructure. They pushed for new building codes. They advocated for a municipal water system dedicated to firefighting. They demanded that all new buildings be constructed with reinforced concrete or structural steel. They were not always successful, but they set a standard. On May 1, 1907, the first major building under the new codes was completed. It was the Union Trust Building at Market and Montgomery. It stood 12 stories tall. It was built with a steel frame and reinforced concrete floors. The walls were fireproof. The foundation was deep. It was a model of what the new San Francisco could be. The building still stands today. In June 1907, a financial panic struck the city. The disaster had drained the banks. Insurance payments were slow. Reconstruction loans were hard to get. The national economy was in recession. Depositors lined up to withdraw their money. Several banks collapsed. The Bank of California closed its doors for a week. The panic spread to the rest of the country. It became known as the Panic of 1907. San Francisco's disaster had helped trigger a national crisis. The federal government stepped in. The U.S. Treasury deposited $50 million in the city's banks to stabilize them. The banking crisis eased, but the damage had been done. Many small businesses went bankrupt. The city's recovery slowed. The homeless camps remained. The reconstruction dragged on. In August 1907, the first complete study of the earthquake was published. It was written by Andrew Lawson, a geologist at the University of California. He had led the investigation commissioned by the city. His report was 400 pages long. It included maps of the San Andreas Fault. It described in detail the displacement of the ground. It estimated the magnitude of the earthquake at 7.8 on a scale that would later be named the Richter scale. It concluded that the fault could produce another earthquake of similar size. It recommended that all buildings within 100 feet of the fault line be prohibited. The report was ignored. The city was too busy rebuilding to worry about future earthquakes. The fault line ran through the western part of the city near the ocean. That area was not densely built at the time. Developers saw an opportunity. They began building houses on the fault line. They sold them to families who did not know the risk. The report was filed away. It would be rediscovered decades later. In October 1907, the city's new water system began construction. It was called the San Francisco Auxiliary Water Supply System. It consisted of 2 reservoirs, one in the hills near Twin Peaks and one near the ocean. The reservoirs were connected to a network of pipes that bypassed the regular water system. The pipes were equipped with special hydrants that could be used by the fire department. The system was designed to withstand earthquakes. It was completed in 1909. It remains in use today. By the end of 1907, the city's population had fallen to about 250, More than 100,000 people had left and never returned. The loss of population had economic consequences. The city's tax base shrank. The municipal budget was strained. Schools were underfunded. Parks were neglected. The city's debt grew, but the city also gained something. The disaster had forced the city to modernize. Outdated buildings were replaced. Dangerous construction methods were abandoned. The city's infrastructure was rebuilt to higher standards. The streets were widened. The sewer system was improved. The city became a laboratory for urban resilience. In January 1908, the last of the refugee camps was closed. The camp at Golden Gate Park was dismantled. The tents were taken down. The earthquake shacks were moved to private lots. The families who had lived in the camps for almost 2 years were finally given a place to call home, but the shacks were not free. The city charged a rent of $2 per month. Many families could not afford it. They left. The cultural impact of the disaster became apparent in the years that followed. The city's art and literature began to reflect the trauma. Jack London, who had written the first account of the destruction, wrote more stories about catastrophe. The poet George Sterling published The City of the Dead, a long poem about the earthquake. The novelist Gertrude Atherton wrote The Californian, a novel that described the rebuilding. The disaster had become a part of the city's identity. In April 1908, the second anniversary of the earthquake was marked by a parade. Fire engines from across the state came to San Francisco. They drove through the streets. The crowds cheered. The parade ended at the site of the old fire. A bronze plaque was unveiled. It read, "On this spot the Great Fire of 1906 was stopped. The city rose again." The plaque is still there, but the anniversary also brought difficult questions. Why had the fire not been stopped earlier? Why had the water system failed? Why had the military shot civilians? The official investigation had answered some questions, but not all. The survivors wanted more. They wanted accountability. They wanted justice. They got neither. The medical impact of the disaster continued for years. In 1909, a study by the city's health department found that the rate of tuberculosis had doubled since 1906. The crowded camps and shacks had provided perfect conditions for the spread of the disease. The number of people who died from tuberculosis in the years after the earthquake was higher than the number who died in the disaster itself. The disaster had created a secondary epidemic. The psychological impact was even harder to measure. In 1910, a survey of schoolchildren found that many had nightmares about fires and earthquakes. They refused to go to basements. They were afraid of loud noises. The trauma had been passed down to the next generation. The city's schools introduced fire drills and earthquake drills. They were the first in the country to do so. The economic recovery finally began in earnest in 1910. The city's port was handling more cargo than ever before. The Panama Canal was opening in 1914, and San Francisco was positioned to become a major hub for trade. The city's business leaders decided to host a World's Fair, the Panama Pacific International Exposition. It would be held in 1915. It would showcase the city's rebirth. The exposition required a massive construction effort. The site was a landfill near the Presidio. Buildings were erected in the Beaux Arts style. They were painted in pastel colors. They were temporary, but they were beautiful. The centerpiece was the Tower of Jewels covered in thousands of glass prisms. At night, it was illuminated by 48 searchlights. It was a symbol of the city's optimism. On April 18, 1915, the 9th anniversary of the earthquake, the exposition opened. Thousands of visitors came. They walked through the exhibits. They marveled at the technology. They celebrated the city's survival. The mayor gave a speech. He said, "San Francisco is no longer a city that was destroyed. It is a city that was reborn." The crowd cheered, but the rebirth was not complete. The poor neighborhoods were still poor. The earthquake shacks were still inhabited. Many had become permanent homes. They were not maintained. They fell into disrepair. The residents were often forgotten. The exposition did not include them. The city's recovery had been uneven, as it always is after a disaster. The legacy of the 1906 earthquake and fire extends far beyond San Francisco. It changed the way Americans think about natural disasters. It led to the creation of state and federal disaster relief programs. It inspired the development of modern building codes. It advanced the science of seismology. It demonstrated the importance of emergency planning. It showed that a city could be destroyed and rebuilt. But the disaster also revealed the limits of human resilience. Thousands died. Tens of thousands were displaced. The city's social fabric was torn. The recovery took years. The trauma lasted a lifetime. The lessons of 1906 are still relevant today. San Francisco remains a city at risk. The San Andreas Fault is still active. The next major earthquake will come. The question is whether the city has learned enough. In 1917, the city began a program to replace the earthquake shacks. They were demolished one by one. The last shack was removed in 1910. It was sent to a museum. It stands today at the Presidio. It is a reminder of what happened. The fire of 1906 is still studied by firefighters. The water system failures are taught in engineering schools. The earthquake is analyzed by seismologists. The response is examined by emergency managers. The disaster has become a case study. It is cited in textbooks. It is referenced in disaster planning. It is a part of history, but for those who lived through it, it is not a case study. It is a memory. It is the sound of the ground shaking. It is the sight of the flames. It is the smell of smoke. It is the loss of everything. It is the struggle to survive. It is the hope of rebuilding. It is the city that burned and rose again. The 72 hours that began at 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, and ended with the containment of the fire on April 20th, are not just a chapter in the city's history. They are the chapter that defines everything that came after. The city that rose from the ashes is not the same city that burned. It is a city that learned, that adapted, and that survives, and it continues to learn today. On April 18, 1926, the 20th anniversary of the earthquake, a group of scientists gathered at the University of California, Berkeley. They were seismologists, geologists, and engineers. They had come to discuss what had been learned in 2 decades. The meeting was held in a building that had been constructed after the earthquake, designed to withstand the next one. The scientists knew that the next earthquake would come. They did not know when. The lead presenter was Andrew Lawson, the geologist who had led the state investigation in 1906. He was now in his 70s. He stood before the audience and presented a map. The map traced the San Andreas Fault from its northern end near Mendocino to its southern end near the Salton Sea. The fault was more than 800 miles long. It was not a single crack in the earth. It was a zone of fractures, some visible at the surface, others buried deep underground. Lawson explained that the 1906 earthquake had ruptured the northern 200 miles of the fault. The southern section had not ruptured. It was storing energy. The audience understood the implication. The southern section would eventually break. When it did, the earthquake would be large. It would affect Los Angeles, not San Francisco. The question was not if, but when. Lawson had come to this conclusion through careful research. After the 1906 earthquake, he had traveled the length of the fault. He had measured the displacement of fences, roads, and streams. He had found that the ground had moved as much as 21 feet in some places. He had mapped the rupture. He had confirmed that the earthquake was caused by the sudden release of stress along the fault. But Lawson was not the only scientist to make progress. Harry Fielding Reid, a geophysicist at Johns Hopkins University, had developed a theory that would become fundamental to seismology. Reid had studied the deformation of the ground before and after the earthquake. He had noticed that the strain had been accumulating for decades. He had proposed that earthquakes occur when the accumulated stress exceeds the strength of the rock. The theory was called elastic rebound. It is still the foundation of earthquake science. In 1926, the scientists at Berkeley did something new. They tried to calculate the recurrence interval of major earthquakes on the San Andreas Fault. They looked at the evidence from trenches, from sediment layers, from historical records. They found that large earthquakes on the northern section of the fault had occurred roughly every 100 to 200 years. The last one had been in 1906. That meant the next one might not come for another century. But the southern section was different. It had not ruptured in recorded history. The scientists could not say when it would break. How could they begin to quantify the intervals on a fault where no seismic events had been observed and where written records did not extend far enough back? They could not, and they admitted it. The science of paleoseismology was still decades away. The tools to measure strain on the fault did not exist. The scientists could only estimate. One of the engineers in the audience that day was John R. Freeman, a hydraulic engineer from Providence, Rhode Island. Freeman had studied the fire in 1906. He had written a report on the water system failures. He had concluded that the city needed a separate emergency water supply. He had helped design the system that was built in 1909. But Freeman was not satisfied. He wanted to know if the lessons of 1906 had been applied to other cities. He had traveled across the country to find out. What Freeman found was not encouraging. Many cities had ignored the lessons. Building codes were still weak. Water systems were still vulnerable. Emergency planning was minimal. The public had forgotten. The disaster was fading from memory. Freeman wrote a new report. It was titled Earthquake Damage and Earthquake Insurance. It was published in 1930. In it, he warned that a similar disaster could happen in any American city. He called for better building codes, stronger water systems, and comprehensive insurance. The report was read by engineers and urban planners, but it did not change policy. The Great Depression had begun. The country had other priorities. In 1933, a different earthquake changed the direction of safety policy. It was the Long Beach earthquake which struck Southern California on March 10th. The magnitude was 6.4. It killed 120 people. The damage was concentrated in schools. Many school buildings collapsed. The students were inside. They survived only because the earthquake occurred at 5:54 p.m. after school had ended. The Long Beach earthquake led directly to the Field Act of 1933. The Field Act required all public schools in California to be built to earthquake-resistant standards. It was the first law of its kind in the United States. It was a direct result of the lessons from 1906 applied to a new type of building. But the Field Act was not retroactive. Schools built before 1933 were not required to be upgraded. Many remained unsafe for decades. The lesson from 1906 had been partially applied, but not fully. In 1941, a geologist named Bailey Willis published a paper that predicted a major earthquake in Southern California. Willis had studied the San Andreas Fault for years. He had concluded that the southern section was overdue. He warned that the earthquake could kill thousands. He called for immediate action. The paper was published in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America. It was read by scientists. It was ignored by the public. World War II shifted attention away from earthquake safety. The country was focused on the war. Resources were directed toward military production. Building codes were not updated. Water systems were not upgraded. The earthquake threat was put aside. In 1952, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck Kern County in Central California. It killed 12 people. The damage was widespread. The earthquake was a reminder that California was still seismically active. But the location was rural, not urban. The impact was limited. The lessons were not fully absorbed. In 1964, the Alaska earthquake, magnitude 9.2, struck near Anchorage. It was the largest earthquake ever recorded in North America. It killed 131 people. The damage was catastrophic. The tsunami caused deaths as far away as California. The earthquake led to the creation of the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program in 1977, but that program focused on research, not enforcement. The local building codes remained the responsibility of cities and states. In 1971, the San Fernando earthquake struck the Los Angeles area. The magnitude was 6.6. It killed 65 people. The damage was severe. Several hospitals collapsed. The earthquake revealed that many buildings built under the Field Act were still vulnerable. The law had required new schools to be safe, but the hospitals were not covered. The lesson from 1906 had not been extended to other critical facilities. The San Fernando earthquake led to new legislation. In 1971, California passed the O'Quist-Prialo Act. The law prohibited the construction of buildings for human occupancy on active fault traces. It was a direct response to the earthquake, but it was limited. It only applied to buildings on the fault line. It did not address the vulnerability of buildings near the fault. In 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake struck the San Francisco Bay Area. The magnitude was 6.9. It killed 63 people. The damage was concentrated in areas built on soft soil, such as the Marina District in San Francisco. The earthquake occurred during the World Series. The television cameras were rolling. The disaster was broadcast live. The Loma Prieta earthquake was a test of the lessons from 1906. The water system failed in parts of the city. The fire department responded quickly. The emergency planning was better. But the soft soil problem had been known since 1906. It had not been fully addressed. The Marina District had been built on landfill. The ground had liquefied. Buildings had collapsed. In 1994, the Northridge earthquake struck the Los Angeles area. The magnitude was 6.7. It killed 57 people. The damage was more than $20 billion. The earthquake occurred on a blind thrust fault, a fault that had not been mapped. The lesson from 1906 was that the fault system was more complex than anyone had imagined. The Northridge earthquake led to changes in building codes. The codes were tightened. The requirements for steel frame buildings were updated. The lessons from 1906 were applied again, but the process was slow. The costs were high. The public resisted. In 2000, the United States Geological Survey published a report titled Earthquake Probabilities in the San Francisco Bay Region. The report stated that there was a 70% probability of at least one magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake in the Bay Area before 2030. The report was based on data from the fault system, including the San Andreas Fault, the Hayward Fault, and the Calaveras Fault. The lessons from 1906 were used to calculate the risk. In 2006, the centennial of the earthquake, a series of events were held in San Francisco. The city commemorated the disaster. The survivors were honored. The scientific progress was celebrated. But the commemorations also included warnings. The next earthquake could come at any time. The city had not done enough. How much had the city done since 1906? The emergency water system was still in place. It had been maintained. It had been expanded. But the system was designed for a fire, not for a major earthquake. The pipes could rupture. The hydrants could fail. The system could run dry. The building codes had been updated many times, but many buildings in San Francisco were built before the codes were strengthened. The unreinforced masonry buildings, the soft-story apartment buildings, the buildings on steep slopes, all of them were still vulnerable. The retrofit programs had been slow. The costs were high. The landlords resisted. The tenants could not afford the rent increases. In 2013, the city passed an ordinance requiring the retrofit of soft-story buildings. The deadline was 2010. The compliance rate was high, but the cost was borne by the landlords and the tenants. Many tenants were displaced. The social cost of the retrofits was real. The lessons from 1906 were being applied, but with social consequences. In 2018, the United States Geological Survey updated its forecast. The probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake in the Bay Area by 2043 was 72%. The probability of a magnitude 7.0 or greater earthquake was 51%. The probability of a magnitude 7.5 or greater earthquake was 20%. The southern section of the San Andreas Fault had a probability of 21% for a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake by 2043. The southern section of the San Andreas Fault had not ruptured since at least 1680, probably longer. The scientists estimated that the southern section was storing enough energy to produce a magnitude 7.7 to 8.3 earthquake. When it ruptured, the earthquake would be felt across Southern California. The shaking would last more than a minute. The damage would be catastrophic. The number of casualties could be in the thousands. In 2019, the city of San Francisco released a report on its earthquake preparedness. The report concluded that the city was better prepared than in 1906 but not prepared enough. The water system would fail. The electrical grid would fail. The transportation system would be disrupted. The communication networks would be overloaded. The hospitals would be overwhelmed. The shelters would be insufficient. The food and water supplies would run out. The report included a timeline. In the first 6 hours after a major earthquake, the city would be isolated. The bridges could be damaged. The tunnels could be blocked. The airports could be closed. The roads could be impassable. The emergency services would be limited. The residents would be on their own. In the first 24 hours, the fire department would respond, but the water system would be limited. The fire engines would carry their own water, but only enough for a few hours. The emergency water system would be used, but the system had not been tested in a major earthquake. The tanks could leak, the pipes could break, the pumps could fail. In the first 48 hours, the National Guard would arrive. The state and federal resources would be deployed, but the logistics would be difficult. The damage could delay the response. The coordination could be complicated. The communication could be lost. In the first 72 hours, the city would be tested. The lessons from 1906 would be applied. The emergency plans would be executed. The resilience of the population would be measured. The outcome would depend on the decisions made in the years before. The 72 hours that defined the disaster in 1906 are not just a memory. They are a template for the next disaster. The same sequence of events could unfold again. The same failures could occur. The same mistakes could be repeated. In August of 2021, a study was published in the journal Seismological Research Letters. The study examined the building stock in San Francisco. It found that 25% of the buildings were vulnerable to collapse in a major earthquake. The vulnerable buildings included unreinforced masonry buildings, soft-story apartment buildings, and buildings on steep slopes. The study estimated that the number of casualties could be as high as 10,000 if a magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck the city. The study also examined the economic impact. The damage could exceed $100 billion. The recovery could take more than 10 years. The population could decline. The city could change. The study was based on the lessons from 1906. The scientists had used the data from the 1906 earthquake to model the next one. They had assumed that the building stock would behave in a similar way. They had assumed that the ground conditions would be similar. They had assumed that the human response would be similar. But the city had changed since 1906. The population was larger. The infrastructure was more complex. The economy was more interconnected. The risk was higher. The consequences could be worse. In October of 2021, the city of San Francisco conducted a large-scale drill. The drill was called Operation Golden Guardian. It simulated a magnitude 7.0 earthquake on the Hayward Fault. The drill involved more than 10,000 participants. The participants included firefighters, police officers, medical personnel, and volunteers. The drill was based on the lessons from 1906. The scenario included a widespread fire, a water system failure, and a large number of casualties. The drill revealed several problems. The communication systems were not interoperable. The radio systems used different frequencies. The agencies could not talk to each other. The coordination was difficult. The response was delayed. The drill also revealed that the public was not prepared. Many residents did not have emergency supplies. Many did not know where to go. Many did not have a plan. The drill was a reminder that the lessons from 1906 had not been fully learned. The city had improved its infrastructure, but it had not improved its public preparedness. The residents were still vulnerable. In February of 2022, a new study was published by the United States Geological Survey. The study updated the earthquake forecast for the San Francisco Bay Area. The probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake by 2043 had increased to 75%. The probability of a magnitude 7.0 or greater earthquake had increased to 55%. The probability of a magnitude 7.5 or greater earthquake had increased to 25%. The study also included a new finding. The Hayward Fault was moving faster than expected. The fault was accumulating strain at a rate of 9 millimeters per year. The fault was overdue for a major earthquake. The last earthquake on the Hayward Fault was in 1868. It was a magnitude 6.8. It killed 30 people. Since then, the population along the fault had grown to more than 2 million. The study estimated that a magnitude 7.0 earthquake on the Hayward Fault could cause as many as 18,000 casualties. The damage could exceed $200 billion. The recovery could take 20 years. The study was based on the lessons from 1906. The data from the 1906 earthquake had been used to calibrate the models. The behavior of the ground had been studied. The response of the buildings had been analyzed. The consequences for the population had been estimated. In April of 2022, the 116th anniversary of the earthquake passed without major attention. The commemorations were smaller. The survivors were fewer. The memory was fading, but the memory is preserved in the archives. The photographs of the destruction are stored in libraries. The reports of the investigation are kept in government buildings. The stories of the survivors are recorded in oral histories. One of those oral histories is from a woman named Mary Lou Lee. She was 7 years old in 1906. She lived with her family in a tent in Golden Gate Park. She remembered the sound of the wind blowing through the canvas. She remembered the smell of the smoke. She remembered the taste of the dust. In the recording, she says, "We had nothing, we had lost everything, but we were together, we had each other, we thought that was enough." She pauses. She continues, "It was not enough, we needed more, we needed a home, we needed food, we needed water, we needed to be safe." She pauses again. She says, "I hope they remember, I hope they learn. I hope they do better than we did." The recording was made in 1976. Mary Lou Lee was 77 years old. She died in 1983. She did not see the centennial in 2006. She did not see the changes in the city. She did not know if the lessons had been learned. In 2023, the city of San Francisco completed a new seismic study. The study used advanced computer models to simulate the effects of a magnitude 7.8 earthquake on the San Andreas Fault. The simulation was based on the data from 1906. The results were sobering. The simulation showed that the shaking would last for 90 seconds. The ground would move up to 6 feet in some places. The buildings would sway. The windows would shatter. The walls would crack. The floors would collapse. The simulation showed that the water system would be severely damaged. The pipes would break in thousands of places. The water would drain away. The tanks would empty. The fire hydrants would be useless. The simulation showed that the fires would start within minutes. The initial fires would be caused by broken gas lines, downed power lines, and damaged electrical equipment. The fires would spread quickly. The wind would carry the flames. The burning debris would land on buildings miles away. The simulation showed that the fire department would be overwhelmed. The number of fires would exceed the number of fire engines. The water would be insufficient. The roads would be blocked. The response would be delayed. The simulation showed that the number of casualties could be as high as 15,000. The number of injured could be as high as 50,000. The number of displaced could be as high as 200,000. The simulation was a reminder that the lessons from 1906 are still relevant. The same failures that occurred in 1906 could occur again. The same vulnerabilities that existed in 1906 still exist today. The same mistakes could be repeated. But the simulation also showed that the city has made progress. The building codes are stronger. The emergency planning is better. The public awareness is higher. The infrastructure is more resilient. The simulation showed that the time to act is now. The next earthquake is coming. The question is whether the city will be ready. In October of 2023, a new initiative was launched in San Francisco. The initiative was called Resilient San Francisco. The goal was to make the city ready for the next earthquake. The plan included retrofitting vulnerable buildings, upgrading the water system, strengthening the electrical grid, improving the communication systems, and training the public. The plan was based on the lessons from 1906. The disaster had shown what could happen. The recovery had shown what needed to be done. The history had provided the blueprint. The plan was ambitious. The cost was estimated at $50 billion. The timeline was 30 years. Funding was uncertain. The political will was unclear. The plan was a reminder that the lessons from 1906 are not just technical, they are also political. The decisions are made by people. The resources are allocated by governments. The priorities are set by the public. In November of 2023, a survey was conducted among San Francisco residents. The survey asked about earthquake preparedness. The results showed that only 40% of residents had an emergency kit. Only 30% had a family plan. Only 20% had taken a preparedness class. The survey showed that the public was aware of the risk but not acting on it. The memory of 1906 had faded. The urgency had diminished. The disaster had become an abstraction. The survey was a reminder that the lessons from 1906 must be taught. The memory must be preserved. The urgency must be maintained. In December of 2023, a new exhibit opened at the Presidio in San Francisco. The exhibit was called 1906, The Earthquake and the Fire. It included artifacts, photographs, and documents from the disaster. It included the last remaining earthquake shack preserved and restored. It included a timeline of the 72 hours. The exhibit was designed to teach the lessons of 1906. It showed what happened. It explained why it happened. It asked what can be done. The exhibit included a quote from an unnamed survivor found scribbled on a piece of charred wood. It said, "We thought it would never happen, then it did. We thought we would never recover. Then we did, but we never forgot." The exhibit opened on December 15, 2023. It will remain open for 5 years. In January of 2024, the United States Geological Survey released a new forecast. The probability of a magnitude 6.7 or greater earthquake in the San Francisco Bay Area by 2043 was now 80%. The probability of a magnitude 7.0 or greater earthquake was 65%. The probability of a magnitude 7.5 or greater earthquake was 30%. The forecast was based on new data from the fault system. The data showed that the strain was accumulating faster than previously estimated. The faults were more active. The risk was higher. The forecast was a reminder that the clock is ticking. The next earthquake is coming. The lessons from 1906 are waiting to be applied. In February of 2024, the city of San Francisco announced a new program to retrofit soft-story apartment buildings. The program provided low-interest loans to landlords. The deadline for compliance was extended to 2025. The cost was subsidized by the city. The program was a direct result of the lessons from 1906. The earthquake had shown that soft-story buildings were vulnerable. The fire had shown that the damage could spread. The recovery had shown that the cost of inaction was high. The program was a step forward, but it was not enough. Thousands of buildings remained unretrofitted. The timeline was too long. The funding was too small. On April 18, 2024, the 118th anniversary of the earthquake, a ceremony was held at Lotta's fountain. The fountain was still there, restored, maintained. It was a symbol of the city's survival. The ceremony was small. The survivors were all gone. The last survivor of the 1906 earthquake, a woman named Ruth Newman, had died in 2025. She was 109 years old. The ceremony was attended by the mayor, the fire chief, the police chief, and a crowd of about 200 people. The speeches were brief. The tone was somber. The mayor said, "We remember the 72 hours that changed our city. We remember the courage of those who survived. We remember the lessons that were learned. We honor the memory by preparing for the next earthquake." The fire chief said, "The fire of 1906 taught us that water is everything. We have improved our system. We have trained our firefighters. We are ready." The police chief said, "The earthquake of 1906 taught us that order is essential. We have practiced our response. We have coordinated with other agencies. We are ready." The crowd applauded. The ceremony ended. The fountain continued to flow. But the question remains, are we ready? The answer is uncertain. The lessons from 1906 have been learned but not fully applied. The progress has been made but not enough. The risk is still high. The time is still short. The 72 hours that began at 5:12 a.m. on April 18, 1906, and ended with the containment of the fire on April 20th are not just a chapter in the city's history. They are a warning. They are a guide. They are a call to action. The city that rose from the ashes is still rising. The lessons from the disaster are still being learned. The work is not done. The next earthquake is coming, and when it does, the city will be tested once again. Whether it passes that test depends on the decisions made today. The memory of 1906 must be kept alive. The urgency must be maintained. The lessons must be applied, because the 72 hours are not over. They are still unfolding, and the final chapter has not yet been written. On the morning of April 21st, 1906, 2 days after the fire had been contained, a new kind of order began to emerge in San Francisco. The city was no longer burning, but it was still in crisis. The military patrols that had been established during the disaster now shifted their focus from firefighting to maintaining civil order. Looting had been a problem in the early hours, and the military had been authorized to shoot looters on sight. At least 5 were killed. The streets were patrolled by soldiers carrying rifles with fixed bayonets. The atmosphere was one of martial law, even though martial law had never been formally declared. The military was acting under the authority of the mayor and the commanding general. What happened next was a process of triage on a massive scale. The city was divided into relief zones. Each zone had a distribution center for food, water, and medical supplies. The military distributed roughly 50,000 loaves of bread a day. Canned goods were brought in from outside the city by rail. The water supply remained compromised, so water was delivered by wagons and tankers. The city's public health officials were already worried about disease. The latrines were overflowing, the dead animals were rotting in the streets, and the living were packed tightly into refugee camps. The fear of typhoid fever and cholera was real. By April 22nd, the city was beginning to count its dead. The official death toll was initially reported as fewer than 500. That number was later revised upward to 3,000, then to 7,000, and finally to between 10,000 and 12,000. Most of the deaths had occurred in the fire, not the earthquake. The bodies were found in the rubble in the burned streets, in collapsed buildings, and in the refugee camps. Many of the dead were never identified. They were buried in mass graves, sometimes without coffins, sometimes without ceremony. The city simply did not have the resources to process that many bodies. What investigators found in the weeks and months following the disaster was a pattern of failure that had been building for decades. The earthquake itself was a natural event. The fire was a man-made catastrophe. The gas lines that ruptured were old and poorly constructed. The water mains that broke were made of cast iron that could not withstand the shaking. The fire department had been undermanned and underfunded. The city had not prepared for a disaster of this scale, partly because the disaster had seemed unimaginable. But the investigations revealed that warning signs had been present. Smaller earthquakes had occurred in the past. The geological evidence of the San Andreas Fault had been documented, but not widely understood. The city had been built on fill and unstable ground in some areas. The lessons were there, but they had not been learned. Why did it take so long to understand what had happened? Part of the reason was that the scientific understanding of earthquakes was still in its infancy in 1906. The theory of plate tectonics would not be developed for another 60 years. Scientists at the time knew that earthquakes were caused by fault movements, but they did not yet have the tools to model them accurately. The 1906 earthquake changed that. It provided a wealth of data that scientists could study for decades. The fault rupture was visible for hundreds of miles. The displacement of the ground was measurable. The shaking patterns were recorded by seismographs around the world. The earthquake became a case study in the emerging field of seismology. The human consequences were staggering. Of the 400,000 people living in San Francisco at the time, half lost their homes. Some lost everything they owned. Many lost family members. The refugee camps housed over 200,000 people at their peak. The camps were organized by the military and the relief committees, but conditions were difficult. Sanitation was poor. Privacy was non-existent. The weather was cold and rainy in the days following the fire. The tents and makeshift shelters provided minimal protection. The psychological trauma of the event was immense, although it was not understood in those terms at the time. People coped by working, by helping neighbors, by rebuilding. But the memory of the earthquake and the fire would stay with them for the rest of their lives. The relief effort was massive. The federal government sent troops, supplies, and money. The Red Cross, led by Clara Barton, who was already in her 80s, provided medical care and food. Private donations poured in from around the world. The state of California sent what it could. The city of Oakland provided shelter for refugees. The railroad companies transported supplies free of charge. The spirit of cooperation was real, but it was also fragile. There were disputes over how to allocate resources. There were accusations of corruption and mismanagement. The relief committees were run by the city's elite, and some refugees felt that they were being treated with condescension or neglect. The disaster exposed the city's class divisions as well as its resilience. Why does this event still matter? The answer lies in the systems that failed and the systems that were built in their place. The 1906 earthquake led directly to the development of modern building codes in California. It led to the establishment of the state's Seismic Safety Commission. It spurred the creation of the University of California's seismology program. It changed the way that engineers designed buildings, bridges, and water systems. The lessons of 1906 were not just about earthquakes. They were about the relationship between infrastructure, government, and human life. They were about preparation, planning, and the consequences of neglect. The event also demonstrated the power of community. In the face of total disaster, people helped each other. They shared food and water. They sheltered strangers. They dug neighbors out of the rubble. They rebuilt their city from the ground up. That resilience is part of the story that is often overshadowed by the destruction, but it is essential to understanding what happened in those 72 hours and in the years that followed. The city was rebuilt within a decade. It was not without its problems, but it was rebuilt. The new buildings were stronger. The water system was redesigned. The fire department was reorganized. The city learned from its mistakes, but the lessons were not permanent. Over time, the memory faded. New buildings were constructed on questionable ground. The water system was allowed to age. The budget for seismic retrofitting was cut. The cycle of neglect began again. In 2024, the city is still vulnerable. The USGS forecast is clear. The probability of a major earthquake in the next 20 years is high. The city has made progress, but it is not enough. The same questions that were asked in 1906 are still being asked today. What will happen when the next earthquake comes? Will the water system hold? Will the buildings stand? Will the city be ready? The answer is uncertain, but the lessons of those 72 hours remain. They are written in the geological record, in the building codes, in the memory of the survivors, and in the science that continues to evolve. The 72 hours of 1906 are not just history. They are a lens through which to see the present. They are a warning. They are a guide. And the final chapter has not yet been written. It will be written in the decisions that are made today, tomorrow, and in the years to come. The question is not whether the next earthquake will happen. It will. The question is whether we will be ready for it.